Course, yes, sir. There we go. Well, welcome again, everyone. I know it's a evening time, which can be a little difficult for people to attend, but I'm happy we're all here today. So for tonight, this is our agenda. I will briefly go over who is Mustard Seed Project, and then I'll pass it on to the amazing Siana, who will give an intro of the night, and will also be our host for our guest speaker and for our panel. And then we'll have a Q&A where if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, so an introduction of who is Mustard Seed Project. So the first thing you should know is that we are all volunteers. There's no one in this organization that is paid. We're about 200 volunteers strong at 6 college universities. Our leadership team is primarily people who have graduated that want to continue the project. And our mission, guided by a hand up, not handout philosophy, is to connect unsheltered and low-income individuals to services and programs through 3 things: community organization, relationship-based outreach, and what we call volunteer case management. And so for our community organizations, all of our young people, especially throughout this pandemic, have mobilized to educate the community about homelessness, have fundraisers, host workshops, things such as that, and clothing drives. We do relationship-based outreach where every single week, a lot of our chapters go out to the streets to provide people with access to basic needs. As one volunteer very, I think, eloquently put it, this is about putting love into the world and showing people respect, right? And we have a lot of people in the group here who actually are part of that weekly outreach and are responsible for doing that. And then this is the magic of Mustard Seed Project, or one of the magics, is our volunteer service navigation program. So this program is a free opt-in, opt-out service for those experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Each client is matched up to one of our trained volunteer service navigators who provide supplementary support to assist clients in pursuing their housing goals. And some of those VSNs are here today. So we consider this low barrier for clients because there is no eligibility for the program other than you are facing homelessness or at risk of it. Our max caseload is 5 to 1, but in practice that really does become 2 to 1, which allows us to be person-centered. The experience we want for clients is that they feel like there's a neighborhood advocate who is supporting them. And of course, because of that, we have a low rate of burnout amongst our volunteers. Our 5 core services are resume building, connecting people to community services, helping with applications, weekly check-ins, and our community relief fund. Okay. We do check in with our clients pretty frequently. And the last thing I'll say about our community relief fund, so this is a fund that we all raise money for. And so it goes to 5 things: for rent subsidies. So this could be application fees, or it could be the rent itself, healthcare subsidies, basic needs, transportation, or personal enrichment, such as furniture or education. And I know I'm talking pretty fast, but that's to give time to our speakers. But in 2021, we provided over $18,000 to 57 clients, and our average payment was $326. And so we prevented a homeless situation via rental assistance for 25 households. And so I was part of the team who was fortunate to give checks to people and say, behind this is a group of young people who care about you and just want to support you throughout this time. Okay. So that is everything from me. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, but I will go ahead and throw it to the amazing Siana, who will be the host for the night.
You're too kind, Martin. But yes, hello everyone. My name is Siana. I will be kind of the MC for the night. So let's go ahead and get started into the guidelines for the forum. So we do want to make sure that everybody knows kind of what the forum series are. We've been having them since January, and they're going to go all the way until June, every 3rd Tuesday of each month, 6:30 to 7:30. And these are some of the goals that we want to kind of uplift and keep in mind when we have these forums. We want to educate the public about systems that perpetuate homelessness, highlight the various intersecting identities and experiences of those facing homelessness, bring together and elevate voices to engage in a necessary dialogue about homelessness, and transform conversation to actions. So it's very much about educating the public, making sure that we are not only learning about what's going on in relation to homelessness, but ways that we can also enact real change. And it's also important, as these forums tend to bring up a lot of sensitive topics around homelessness, and just we want to make sure this is a safe space for everybody and that everyone's voice can be heard and respected as well. So these are some of the ground rules that we like to abide by during our forums. Mute yourself when you're not talking. I know we've all been in Zoom for a long time, but just make sure we're muted and we're not talking so we can get out the most from all of our speakers. You can use the raise hand feature, but I think the most prominent way is we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll be sure to I'll be sure to ask it to our speakers when the time is right. Hate will not be tolerated. Like I said, we want to be respectful. This is a respectful forum. We want to make sure that we are, like I said, for the third time, respecting each other. And like in the last bullet point, open and safe space for respectful discussion. So if you haven't caught on by now, respect is really important to us. We want to make sure that everyone feels respected. And this is one of the parts that upon registration, you saw this donation page, and we really, really appreciate any donations that we do have. All these funds go to the Community Relief Fund, which Martin was talking about previously, which is the funds that we use to directly help our clients. And we want to make sure that we are continuously able to help our clients. And this is the primary way that we do so. It's all from donations and fundraising, all of our fundraising that all of our chapters do, but we greatly appreciate it, and we highly, not necessarily suggest, but we would greatly appreciate any donations that we would get through this event today. And without further ado, we will get into our panelists for the night. So our keynote speaker, as you may have seen on all of our lovely flyers, is Bob Harrison. I'm gonna let everybody introduce themselves a little when there comes time to talk. But Bob Harrison is our keynote speaker. He's a former chief of police and an adjunct researcher with RAND, which I'm sure he will talk about once he gets to talking. And for our Q&A session later, we will also have we are joined by Chelsea Swift, who is a crisis worker with Cahoots out of Eugene, Oregon. It's a great organization, and I'll let Chelsea talk a little bit more about that when it comes time. And we also have Curtis Howard on the line. He's the chairman of All of Us or None. And for those of you who have been with MSP for a while, we had him as a speaker last year for our Prison to Homeless Pipeline Community Forum series, and it was a great turnout, and we're very much appreciative to have you back, Curtis. So without further ado, we will kick it off with Bob Harrison.
Great, thank you, Sienna. It's a pleasure to be with folks who are on the solution side of enterprise in policing throughout the decades. And as one might tell, if your visual is on, I've been around for a little while. I have almost the full arc of not only this issue, but many others where people have grappled with ways to best handle the social crises that for years, for decades, the police and almost the police alone dealt with. Sometimes very well, sometimes very poorly, as we were left to deal with mental health crisis without sufficient training, to deal with domestic violence, where we finally have actually develop the kind of networks that I would hope and envision for issues of vulnerable populations and persons experiencing homelessness, that they are wraparound and multidisciplinary. It's not just call 911. I mean, as people may realize, and a couple of groundings is when we talk about the police, quite often I find people talk about the police as they might the Marine Corps or the military or Congress, a unified body that actually has some sense of coherent structure, when in fact there are about 18,000 policing agencies across America. The median size is under 20. Very few mega agencies are split amongst the 50 states, the territories, the tribal jurisdictions. Each community itself, which is both its advantage and disadvantage, can request, require, and interact with the type of policing they desire for their community. And I think that communities themselves, until the past few years, have been very passive as recipients. Policing agencies would hold neighborhood forums, unless there's a crime series, when everyone shows up to kind of yell at them about why they haven't arrested the bad guys, to their own devices, sometimes out of necessity because of professional expertise or danger of what we did, but quite often because people are busy leading their lives. The second thing is that policing, of course, is part of what everyone recognizes as the criminal justice system. And even for the police themselves, sometimes we forget that we are actually part of the public safety system itself. And I'm doing some research now at RAND. I'll talk about RAND in a second or two, about if we created communities where happiness was the first filter, where peace and tranquility was the standard by which community safety was measured, it might be radically different than merely assuming that, well, crime's not occurring, so we're okay. You know, the people who have no voices aren't being heard, which really makes that not so. And I think certainly uh, people online now and my co-panelists know the issues at least as well, if not much better than I do, because they're dealing directly with it. I'm more of a generalist. A little bit of my background, and I think one of the useful elements of my background that might inform why I'm so passionate about this is that my mom ran away from home in the Indian reservation at 13 years of age during World War II. Stole money from her mom and took the bus to Los Angeles, where she got off at Union Station, got fake ID so she could work, and lived on her own for the next decade. She was a client of the Los Angeles Rescue Mission. When I was a small child and my parents had gotten married, of course, had children, kind of stabilized in that post-war blue-collar housing in East Los Angeles. I always kind of wondered when I was a kid why on Saturday mornings, my mom, who worked as sojourns down to the urban core of Los Angeles, open the van and feed people. Depth. I think a lot of it was the pain of actually having that experience, surviving it, which she did remarkably well. That really kind of brought home to me in a very personal level. I grew up, as you might expect, in the backs of restaurants. And if anyone wants to get a real feel for the diversity of the world, they just have to work in restaurants in Los Angeles, because you have people from all corners of the earth. You have people from differing perspectives and cultures and languages. There is a significant amount and has been a significant amount of interaction with vulnerable populations in restaurants informally. You know, people who come by to have a meal, people who come by looking for help, people coming by to look for casual work. And I think the downside is, and if you look at the tens of millions of persons who are vulnerable, who are experiencing homelessness, who are living at the edges, it far too long was a somewhat casual ad hoc response where if there were problems or large gatherings or tent villages, let's call the cops and clean them out, which wound up being entirely unsatisfactory to all involved. If they didn't cause problems, there weren't many services because there were more critical things that we took care of. So it's almost this covert tragedy of in the fabric of life, and people understand that it occurs, but unless they come in direct contact, they may not think about the depth and the complexity of populations that struggle, populations that are living either from paycheck to paycheck or going from meal or missing a meal to meal for a variety of reasons. I mean, we are seeing now, especially in the post-pandemic era, the economic issues that have been brought to bear, people who lost jobs, lost livelihoods, and are looking for a way back. You have people, and I think it's taken a lot of the prominence, especially as the nexus of homelessness intersects with it, is mental health crisis. You know, we're finally to a point to perhaps remedy and reverse what happened in the 1970s and 1980s when the state of California shut down mental hospitals, remove mental health care from a primary position in society to something that was an afterthought. As I've experienced and as an officer for more than 30 years, the great tragedy of people who fall into a position of extreme vulnerability in and of itself is exceptionally stressful, can create mental health issues to merely cope with or to deal with the stress. And so we look at mental health crisis, and then we look, of course, at addiction and substance use, you know, not a cause of. I think, you know, one of the core causes of persons experiencing homelessness is a lack of available, affordable alternatives, a lack of housing. You know, we're starting to see things like the Hilda Solis Village in Los Angeles, where they're converting containers to residential units. We're seeing even Cambridge in the UK has set up a similar function to provide housing intervention, and it's the hand up and hand out to where people can move back to lives they wish to be productive. I know there's a Cambridge University study, and one of the researchers said, you know, there's nothing like having a front door. You know, there's nothing like having the opportunity to be safe, that many of us take for granted, that certainly those who are experiencing homelessness don't at all. I mean, it's in their face all day, all night. And then, of course, there is, and on the law enforcement side, and I'll talk about RAND just momentarily, we do have a change in some of the substance use norms. Of course, people are focused on fentanyl. RAND Corporation has done a tremendous amount of work on policy with regard to fentanyl and how to combat the opioid epidemic, especially the fentanyl overdoses, which are crossing societal and cultural boundaries. And it's 95% of people who OD on fentanyl have accidental deaths. It's not an intentional overdose as it would be for a heroin addict who knows what they're taking, but has a hot shot, or somebody that suffers from taking more than their body can now withstand. And what we've seen as a response to the reduction in availability of ephedra is the manner in which methamphetamine is produced using P2P meth, as they would call it on the street, is much more insidiously destructive neurally. And so you're starting to see populations where addicts no longer are necessarily acting out as seek help, much less likely to be visible, which makes it even more complex to deal with them. So after 30 years in policing, and I did pretty much most of the things you might expect someone who lasted that long. I worked in patrol. I worked in South Central Los Angeles for a number of years. Worked in Orange County, worked up through management, spent the last 6 years as an executive. My passion as a chief, although homelessness was an issue, the criticality for me was tranquility in the home. I led work with a bunch of remarkable people who worked with me to create the first multidisciplinary family services team in the state, the first full-time elder abuse investigators. I had 17 mental health social service professionals on staff dealing with all aspects of family dysfunction, child abuse, domestic violence, elder abuse. We even participated in First Five doing welcome baby programs with our social services to provide people means by which to succeed in parenting and succeed in homes. And there's a little bit of a rub-off effect in terms of how people can grow healthily, how we can problems before they occur. That also relates to this. So beyond RAND, I was really fortunate. I'm the first career police officer that RAND's ever hired as a researcher. I'm not sure if sheer curiosity might not have prompted that hire, or unfortunately, it was several years before these recent tragedies have erupted, and but my position has been much more prominent in the last few years as I've had an opportunity to move out of homeland security and justice policy, where I do a lot of my work, into appearances such as this, talking with media outlets, working on panels, and trying to get people to move away from, in some sense, I think the police themselves understand they have issues and problems they dramatically and desperately need to remedy. And everyone here would have either a personal story or a colloquial story, and certainly we've all seen the videos that point that out prominently. But I have and have worked with police command personnel as well as executive personnel in the last couple of years. They are as desperate as you may be to look for solutions. And most of them, if not the vast majority, are more than willing to collaborate and work constructively with communities. And so as people listen here, or people that watch this later on think, you as a consumer of public safety services have an opportunity, have a right to interact with the police department and ask them the tough questions. What are you doing? How do you handle this? What's your policy in this regard? I'm really interested in issues of persons experiencing homelessness. What's the status here? And what's our community's response? I mean, I'm really proud. I have some former students as chiefs of police throughout the state, and the city of Long Beach is one instance where they've moved to a multidisciplinary platform where the police are part of a solution, but not the solution, where we're far less punitive and far more public health problem solving in orientation. In fact, we had an executive panel at RAND the year before last where the executives themselves said, listen, we would gladly reduce and divert our funding if in fact they set up social service, mental health, and homeless services that could handle the problems that are brought to our door on a daily basis. So I think there's a willingness by a vast majority of the police to work constructively, for people to look for the issues that are tailored to the community because it's not a one size fits all. I mean, I'm familiar with Cahoots. I'm familiar in domestic violence with the Red Hook approach to offender services. I was part of the team that helped set up family justice centers, not only here but in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So, it's remarkable what can be done when people don't take no for an answer. When people really are sincere at looking for solutions and working collaboratively, and I think, by and large, your policing agency, whatever jurisdiction you may live in, has a responsibility to do that. Don't let them off the hook or just assume they're busy. In fact, they are. I mean, policing is in a near state of crisis. We don't really so much have a recruitment problem as we do an attraction problem. I'm going to guess that the number of people in here who are the professional hiring age, that if I found one or two of you that might even think about joining a police department, that might surprise me. And that's really sad, because you represent the kinds of people and the perspectives and outlooks that I think will thrive in where policing is going into the future. I think that they're more than open to look for constructive solutions to resolve how people view them. I mean, national surveys show pervasively that even and especially in urban communities, people want the police. Just as strongly, they want them to address their issues and be more responsive. So there's a lot of room to move forward. I think that working holistically, it's easy to hate a stranger. What's really tough is to break bread with someone and sit around a table and look to solve problems, and not to really start to immediately recognize this is another human. They have a lot to offer, whether I am a police chief, a community advocate, a member of the school board, a concerned parent, whoever you might be. If we work together to solve some of these issues, I think it's just, remarkable things can be done. Now, Rand Corporation, some may have heard the name, at least loosely. Rand actually was the first what we call think tank in the world. It was created shortly after World War II, actually as an evolution of the Manhattan Project, where the government elected to keep together a bunch of really smart people to solve federal problems. Since that time, we've grown remarkably. In fact, we have dedicated researchers, senior behavioral scientists who work specifically on this issue. Out of our Santa Monica office, we have Sarah Hunter, who's passionate. She's published more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and works directly with those who are working with vulnerable populations to develop evidence-based outcomes. And that would be probably one reality check and caution for those who may wish to just like start doing things. I mean, I think your effort of the Mustard Seed Project passes muster. Cahoots passes muster with flying colors in terms of what they do, their intended outcomes, and its impact. But people should think about, what do we want to do? What's our vision for the outcomes? How do we actually know those are happening without relying on stories or like, oh, it feels good to do it or something like that? And I think, and this is goes all the way back around to my mom, and I'll stop in a minute or two and see if there are questions, that I am a longtime supporter of the San Diego Rescue Mission. I live in the San Diego area. I think the county itself, for those who live here or go to school here, is fortunate because there are a lot of best practice examples, whether you go to the homeless outreach teams in almost all of the agencies in the county. If you look at the array of non-governmental public services, if you look at something like the Downtown San Diego Project that does its monthly census of persons experiencing homelessness, tracks, intervenes, the rescue mission, in fact, through donations, has had funded mobile showers, mobile meals. They have graduates of the residential program who will go back into the community and work with those. I've seen data that says that, in fact, Long Beach, I believe, had data that said people who are living on the street will decline help 16 times before they might say yes. So it's not just enough to walk down and say, hey, would you like to have a hot meal? Or would you like to fix today's problem? Would you like a hotel room? I mean, all of those things are great and noble and consistent with human caring. But to think about, hey, if you're ready, here are some options, here are some places. Let's get you the help you need. Let's access services. Let's do some wraparound work to really address the underlying causes. Because, and I have found, and one of the most gratifying times I have twice a year is when the rescue mission does their graduation from their residential programs, and to meet the people and listen to them, to hear their stories of renewed hope, reintegration, reunification with families, kind of reunification with themselves, because many of them express the fact that I was just lost. I got to a point where no one cared. I don't know if I cared for myself. I didn't know what else I was going to do. And to be able to be part of one of many organizations that goes into the community, that seeks to help and stays to help, even if they don't get an immediate response, that looks beyond perhaps blame placing to the human, that looks beyond the constraints of, well, we're not funded or there's no formal thing, that really works to help. And I think that San Diego especially is kind of a, fair weather receiver community of large vulnerable populations, is doing a really good job. There's always room for improvement. It heartens me. I mean, it's really easy when I talk to, people in their 40s and 50s, the boomers who are out there, and I'm older than a boomer, so I'm exempt from that too, but who may look at the kids, people in their teens and 20s, and oh my God, they're just on their smartphones and all they care about is a TikTok video or the next Snapchat that comes across their screen. To see people, and I have seen, I've done guest lecturing at Stanford, I've gone to other universities, working at Rand, I come across a lot of diverse people. It's really heartening to see that you represent this next generation of caring adults that will work through, I think, some of the crises we have now. When you are my age, kids who are your age will have different crises, and you'll be able to tell them how you work to solve yours, which gives them guideposts. And I think right now, in ways maybe never before, because of social media and connections like this, where we can connect electronically without having to travel for days or meet for a few minutes, that we can really dive below the surface and work as humans with humans to solve the social problems that we have. So I'll go ahead and I'll stop now. Sienna, if you have questions either from the audience or things that people may wish to cover. I've heard almost every question people might want to ask of the police, so feel free to ask them. I'm not an apologist for the profession, but one who's managed to survive at the far end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. I know I jotted down some notes of the things that you said. And before I get into one of my questions, there was a question in the chat from John, and he asked, what do you mean by fair weather receiver?
Well, San Diego and West Coast communities themselves, I think, versus having worked in Milwaukee, having worked in some very cold weather climes where they deal with populations somewhat differently. I know San Diego, where people assume the sun is always shining, people may come here because the weather is less harmful if you are a vulnerable population, if perhaps you're not housed. We have good access to social services. We have good access to NGOs and helping organizations, which some people, and this is the other edge of the sword, some might say, and I've talked with people privately, said, maybe if we just offered a little bit less, we wouldn't have this problem. Maybe if it wasn't so attractive, people wouldn't show up. And of course, that's the wrong attitude, but it's a human attitude that's out there. But I think climate, access to service, access to employment are all draws. I mean, it's the reason that everybody would like to come to California at some point as a tourist. It's like, oh, I could live here because, there's a lot of opportunity as California always is.
Yeah, absolutely. And John also, I don't know if you have access to the chat, Bob, but he said, but as of last PITC, which I'm unfamiliar with what that means, so I would love to know what that means, less than 20% came from outside San Diego.
Yes. Yeah, and I've seen some of the, I would say that number doesn't surprise me. I mean, we have had, a person's experiencing homelessness for decades. I would say that the crisis in general has expanded phenomenally. I think anyone who works in the industry knows that the counts of persons experiencing homelessness is generally assumed to be far less than the actual numbers. I'm downtown San Diego right now. I go out and walk early in the morning. And it flexes and flows. I can look at the partnership census on a monthly basis, and sometimes you can track some of that seasonally. Others, it's much more. There is a core element that is persistently here. But yeah, no, I'm not saying that is the problem. I'm saying it's, like anything else, it's one of the contributing factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We are about to transition into our panelists, but we wanted to ask you this question in terms of what you were talking about. You're talking about there's a difference between like the vision and the outcome of that vision. So there's a lot of intentions. There's a lot of things that we want solutions. Police are trying to figure out ways to really uplift the community, protect the community, public safety, all of that. But sometimes, in execution, maybe it doesn't necessarily outlay the same way. So because just for sake of time, if we can get a brief answer from you, that would be wonderful. But how would you say the police balance the importance of public safety when it comes to, keeping the streets clean and drug safety, stuff like that, versus the criminalization of poverty and the criminalization of homelessness, people getting ticketed for sleeping on the streets or sleeping in their cars? So how do you think, police currently or could better balance those two different things?
I think they have, in many ways crossed the Rubicon on, it being a criminal behavior. I think we've seen some of the more draconian measures of clearing out property and throwing it away. I think there are now court decisions that prohibit that I think express a move in the right direction. As I talk to, and I talk to officers and deputies from dozens, if not hundreds of agencies every year, almost all of them are merely looking for solutions too, because they do balance the rights of the individual, the business community that desires to have an attractive business community that encourages people to come spend their money, a residential community that has, persons of all ages transiting through, living in. That balancing those is a much more difficult act at times than some might assume, coupled with the fact that people generally, they rarely schedule crime. We don't know when the next thing's happening. The seriousness of the erratic nature of crime right now is something that I think we're really struggling to see if this is the new normal or if this is a blip as people kind of go back to, a regression to the mean, to a baseline of activity. But there's a lot of soul searching at the executive levels now. There are a lot of policing agencies that are desperate for strong community solutions. So I do think that for those who say, well,
Uh-oh.
is logic because they're not really going anywhere. And at 4 a.m, that's who you're just going to show up when you call, unless you have, hearty alternatives. I mean, if I had cahoots in my neighborhood, they'd be amongst my best friends because not only provide better solutions, they offload from me work in areas where someone else is better trained. And we can dedicate that time to preventing crime, identifying those responsible, and meeting the other needs, the myriad needs of the community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a perfect segue into the introduction of the rest of our panelists. And so before we get too deep into questions, Curtis and Chelsea, if you want to unmute you and introduce yourself to the group, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Curtis Howard. I am the lead organizer and chairman for All of Us or None San Diego chapter. All of Us or None is a advocacy group for formerly incarcerated people and their families. We have 27 chapters nationwide. I am the chapter of the San Diego chapter. I also am currently a lived experience advisor for the regional task force for homelessness in San Diego. I'm on the advisory board for Housing for the Homeless, and I'm a published writer as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Chelsea, if you'd like to unmute and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Swift. I go by my last name at work, and that's how it's saved in the Zoom chat. So I just left it as is. You could call me either. I am a crisis worker on Cahoots, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. We are a department of Whitebird Clinic, which is a federally qualified health center now, but started as a collective in the late 60s in my community. And Cahoots has been operating since 1989. I'm also a medic on the Cahoots van, which my scope is EMT basic. So I function in both a crisis counselor worker role as well as a medic role, depending on the day, depending on who my partner is. And de-escalation trainings to the community. I've been involved with some of our consulting with cities, orgs elsewhere who are looking at implementing mobile crisis intervention, police alternative responses, and love to come to meetings like this and talk about our work. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really glad we have a lot of great speakers. We heard from Bob. We love Bob, and we are about to hear from Curtis and Swift, and so we are very much ready to get into it. So thank you here. So first question, general question is, what are some of the current challenges homeless individuals are facing when it comes to policing? I know this is a very grand question, but we would love to hear from anyone, Curtis, Swift, or Bob, if you want to jump in, but go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as part of the outreach team for Regional Task Force for Homelessness, we have been conducting a lot of focus groups where we have went out and engaged the community in a series of different questions and regarding that. I have to say that in our most recent focus group, we had less complaints about the police as we expected. We didn't really expect, but they actually didn't have as much to say a negative as we expected. However, I don't necessarily feel that that there is a place for law enforcement in homelessness. I feel that groups such as the Mustard Seed Project and yourselves and the work that you do is more geared toward the homelessness. When Bob stated that people want the police, well, people want the police to enforce things that directly impact them. Who wants the police when it comes time to homelessness? The store owner who has people sleeping in front of his store. They want the people with homes who have people, homeless people going through the trash and hanging out in front of their neighborhood. That's who actually wants the police. Technically, I don't feel that that there's a place for the police in homelessness just by virtue of their role being in law enforcement. I'll say this: I'm a former gang member. I joined the Crips when I was 14 years old. I'm one of the first gang members in San Diego. I'm the first actual gang member to carry a casket of the very first death related to the Crips and Bloods in San Diego in 1981. Now, I am no longer that. I have transitioned past that. So now I look at things differently than I did then. See, back then, if I was approached and confronted, my reaction would be to poke my chest out and to challenge the person who challenged me. That is a direct result of what I live. Police, as a result of their nature in law enforcement, are more inclined to respond to things in a law enforcement type of manner. Now, Bob has transitioned and he has become involved in a lot of other things where he has educated himself in homelessness and been participant in different things and educated himself past the knowledge of the average cop that's on the streets right now. So you see, Bob can't really speak for the active law enforcement as I can't speak for the gang members. I can tell you that I may not respond to you in a certain way, but you know what? I can't guarantee you that the guys I left won't. I can't speak for them because I know how they operate, because I once operated with them, like Bob once operated with law enforcement. I just don't feel like there's a solid place for law enforcement in homelessness. And the only time that they really come is when it's to enforce issues where people call the police. There's no other way that that they become involved. And that's not, and I don't oppose Bob and what he does, but I'm just saying that he has transitioned into another level of understanding and engaging the public's homeless population.
Right, absolutely. There's definitely multiple ways to look at it. And like you're saying, like what's happening now versus what happened then, which is what will happen, is all could be two completely different things. So that totally makes sense. And John, I do see your hand. I'm gonna give it to Swift real fast, and then we'll loop right back to you afterwards. Swift, if you wanted to speak on, I can repeat the question again from your perspective.
I've got it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And like, as you said, when you asked this question, this could be an infinite answer, but I think to like stay on theme of this forum and to maybe kind of build upon, bridge the experiences we've heard about, is I would say one of the biggest barriers, one of the biggest issues facing people who are homeless and everyone who is in community together experiencing these issues. Yeah, well, one of the biggest issues is access. And I am grateful enough and still surprised 5 years later to be a first responder. This is not work that I ever expected to do, period. And as long as when someone who is poor's phone runs out of minutes, if the only number that phone can call is 911, we need alternatives. We need other things within that system. So right now there are wait lists for shelters in most major cities, much less housing, much less getting in with a mental health prescriber, primary care physician, therapists, and like, let's hope that any of those people will meet you in person right now. The most accessible system for human interaction when someone is in crisis, whether it is an emergency of safety or an emergency of need, is the 911 system. So the problem is that police have made themselves the most accessible social service servants. And as Bob has said, they are very burnt out on that too. And then to maybe speak more to like the nature that people who are homeless and law enforcement of their relationship that they have is antagonistic in nature. Most of the laws being enforced are to protect capital, private property, to protect what ends up playing out as certain classes and demonizing, criminalizing, harming poor people, lower classes. So that relationship by design is antagonistic, and that is why it feels bad for all parties involved. And yes, why it cannot totally be reconciled, in my opinion, with just more trainings or just more creative solutions within the policing framework. So what is unique about Cahoots compared to co-responder models, like mentioned in the chat, is that we are a team that is, I'm an employee of Whitebird Clinic. My agency contracts with the city of Eugene and the city of Springfield, and our services are administered through the police department. So we are a separate entity. And when I show up, my hope is that people see the Whitebird Clinic logo on my shirt, which has been an agency around for over 50 years that started as a place for people to go when there was nowhere else. That logo is what keeps me safe when I knock on someone's door at 3 a.m. That logo keeps me safe when I'm in the park, also at 3 a.m. So I think there are room for all the alternatives like of co-response and different models within policing while the world is set up like it is right now, where 911 is the most accessible. And outreach role is putting on the pressure, highlighting the barriers of agencies who are simultaneously making themselves less and less accessible, and that often the social service, mental health system, medical field are just as complicit in forcing police to respond to the issues that these systems are not addressing for the highest need, lowest access populations.
Right. No, absolutely. Accessibility is definitely something that us here at Mustard Seed Project, we talk a lot about, which is why we have our service navigation program, so we can help individuals navigate the many services that are out there, because there are a lot of services. Granted, they may not be encompassing all the needs that there are, but there are services, and people sometimes just don't have the support, don't have the ability to navigate those services. So I definitely shout that point out. And before we get to John, we just wanted to give, I saw Bob in the chat. If Bob, you had any responses to the question that I asked, and I can repeat it.
Not so much, and it is. I mean, I appreciate the candor, people involved. I mean, of scope and size of cahoots, I think the police would be more grateful than most anybody else in their community, because they understand that they're the ones, and I do appreciate the candor and saying, you know, the medical communities, the mental health communities, social service. As a chief, the reason I had 17 licensed mental health social service professionals is because the county and the state weren't providing the services. And so we diverted funding to do that, had a ton of grant funding follow once we had a successful model. I would say that, and you know, as part of the mythology of policing, and I'm only going to rely on anecdotal evidence, but the vast majority of instances where the police contact persons experiencing homelessness do not result in an enforcement action. The police, and speaking to members of homeless outreach teams in San Diego and Chula Vista directly and talking to their managers, they are more than happy to serve as resource allocators, to work with Father Joe's Village, the Downtown Partnership, Rescue Mission, as navigators of services themselves, because it serves the police well if it offloads from them moving somebody into a criminal justice profile, unless they have an active warrant, at giving them the resources to remove the problem for all and give the human dignity and help to someone who may need and want it, who doesn't know what to do, is, I mean, you know, the vast majority of cops, and this has shown surveys throughout the years, interpolicing to help people. And community service, I just finished an assessment of a national survey of the police. Well over 7 out of 10 said the most satisfying thing that they find in their profession is working with the community. So, I mean, in many ways, cops will respond as communities begin to develop capabilities that allow them to do the things they got into policing for, protect the public in the public safety, criminal justice realm, and spend far less time on the things where it's quality of life, a disturbance of peace, where if the problem can be resolved by cahoots or other intervention services, I think the police would be as happy as anyone else, and quite often happier, because they can then focus time where they actually are trained and can professionally respond.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I see your hand. I give you the floor. Uh-oh, we can't hear you. No. But we will come back. We will circle back to you. So just raise your hand again or put it in the chat when you have audio, and we'll come back to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that.
No
I
worries.
apologize. So first off, I want to thank all of the panelists for being here. This has been really informative. You know, Curtis, I've seen you before. You're an amazing speaker. Bob, this is the first time I think I've connected with you, and I really want to mention that you know, the work of Cahoots and Swift. So I have a couple of different questions. So first off, you know, I want to talk about one of the things that we're working on is shelter solutions. And our mass shelter system is really pretty brutal to put somebody in. I mean, to say that we are providing housing someone and we're placing them into an environment with 1 to 2 to 300 people, all with varying conditions, ages, personal issues. It is almost as traumatizing, as I've heard from many of our advocates, as it is being on the street. So a lot of people refuse shelter for that reason. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that having lived on the street, I had a couple of incidences where I was either being threatened or had been robbed and it called the police, and no one would respond because I didn't have an address. So I wanted to talk about those two things, and also, I think, Bob, you'd mentioned the hot team and the fact that, I love the hot team here. I think they're all amazing individuals. The problem is that they're essentially wearing the same uniforms as the regular police, and commonly there's just a misconception between the two services and the organizations. And quite frankly, for many of the people that have been living on our streets, there have been reports of late night harassment and abusive police enforcement that we need to address. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah,
Thank
John,
you.
Bob here. I just wanted to mention too, I'd fully agree with you. If I were working as a chief today, my hot team would be in field appropriate but soft clothing. I think that the visual moniker, it helps to better identify someone who people know as a resource and a helper. I mean, formally, this is my job to help you, versus someone who respond in more general terms. And of course, treating people in undignified ways, treating them in ways that serve.
Uh-oh. Did we lost Bob? We'll give him a couple seconds to move on to the next question.
Well, I'd also like to hear from Curtis and Swift about those questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Whoever would like to go first.
I think, what was that? Can you reiterate that for me, please? That question, what was that exactly?
Well, it was, first off, if you're on the streets and you've been criminalized, when you call 911, generally it's not responsive. Nobody comes out.
Right.
And then the other question, environments with 1 to 2, 300 people with varying conditions, ages, issues, etc., and really to assume that that is a hospitable environment for anyone is questionable. So I just would like your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and thank you for that, for your response earlier, John. And yes, absolutely. All of these things have to be taken into consideration. As I'm an advocate for formerly incarcerated people, I would be way less inclined to go to a shelter just because it would re-traumatize me as being incarcerated. It would be the same crowded atmosphere with people, the bunk beds, everything going on.
And with less regulation, right? Like,
absolutely. Authority, policies and rules. I don't want to inject myself and re-traumatize myself by re-entering a place like this. Absolutely. And the last thing I would want to do is actually to call the police if something happened with me, because especially if I have a history of negative experience with law enforcement and they show up and turn on me, and it's likely that they will. And it's likely that if they see who I am, they will brush me off as being insignificant. I have better things to do. I have more important people who are being violated than you that I have to tend to, other than you out here on the street. So the homeless community is less likely to even call the police for anything through the third degree. Have you been drinking today? Are you under the influence of anything? Going way off of what the entire reason for the call or the contact is to begin with. The police, by virtue of their nature, are more inclined to handle things as a police than as a social worker or a community person that's trying to engage and help. If a police comes up on a homeless person, they're just, by nature, they're gonna say, have you been drinking? Have you been doing any drugs? It's like, you know, do you mind if I search you? Are you on probation or parole, by the way?
Right. Police, because that's a
Exactly.
violation, right? I mean,
Exactly, which opens the door to a lot of different things. So these are things that you have to really understand in order you have to know about in order to understand why things are the way they are, understand why a person is rejecting going to a homeless shelter when somebody said, oh, he doesn't want help. She doesn't want help. We just offered them to some shelter. They said no. You know, they don't want help. You have to understand and what's going time necessary to educate yourself on it by dealing with lived experience people like John, with lived experience advisors like me, with a lived experience consultant. You will never get it. You can dance around it and go around it all you want, but you have to engage the community, and you have to engage lived experience people and get the story that's there for you. Thank you.
thank you, Curtis. And I'll just say, in case anybody doesn't have a concept of what it's like to be in one of our shelters, you have 180 to 280 people packed into bunk beds less than 6 feet or maybe 10 feet apart from each other, and multiple conditions, mental health issues, addiction, you name it. And I mean, it's, you know, it's less comfortable than being in prison because there is an enforcement of rules and regulations, and really frustrating. So I just wanted to share that because that's one of the things we're working on. Thank you, Curtis.
Yes, thank you so much. And I see, Bob, we've got you back.
Yes, just in time. I just wanted to show you I actually could come back in the meeting. Yeah, and my apologies. I have a secure computer, and if it breaks, I have to go through like a 12-step process to actually get back in. I apologize. For me, though, this helps. I do, and as some might see if you've seen my bio, I manage a graduate program for aspiring chiefs of police and sheriffs. I speak and teach nationally, do a lot of conference work to maintain contact with those who are doing the work. And I'm a strong advocate for innovation and radical change in policing. I think we have great opportunity and still have a great groundswell of support in many communities, and need to use that remaining goodwill for nothing short of a transformative effect. And I think this is part of it. If you look at homelessness, mental health crises, family violence, you know, some of the tragedies of under and unreported crimes, you know, dealing with vulnerable populations. I think, though, to me, and this is only mine, those who exclude the police do so by denying a resource that's readily available, where most of its practitioners would willingly cooperate, and to put aside perhaps some of the thoughts of a few that may object because it ain't the old way of doing policing, you know, just move beyond them to be more constructive. So I appreciate the time. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we're glad to have you hop back on. I wanted to give Swift a chance to answer the question as well that John posed. So if we need to repeat the question, we can, but I did see Swift unmute. So I want to give you the space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear the issues are the same, right? Like homeless shelters are oppressive and feel like prisons by design. They are made to have that same sense of don't get too comfortable, that same sense of yeah, this is temporary. You are around masses of people. And we have in Eugene, which again, Cahoots operates in 2 towns, but Eugene has like one of the highest per capita homeless populations. I know a lot of y'all are in Southern California. You feel and see this in a very similar way as we do. And what it comes back to as someone without lived experience, but I did work for a few years in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury doing street outreach and harm reduction work before I came up here, is I have never met somebody who is living outside, currently homeless, who, when you say, oh, like, what do you wish was your next step? What do you think this community needs? No one has ever said to me, oh, I wish we had a homeless shelter. I just like, that's where I wish I could go. People want housing. People want to be able to have autonomy in what that looks like. And congregate homeless shelters, which look like prisons, are designed to remove autonomy. I also think there is a nuanced issue where a lot of the solutions to homelessness right now look like, yeah, these like techie, innovative, how can we make these tiny homes out of these crazy cheap materials? And it's like, what if we just had infrastructure that supported the humans in our communities? Like, we are overthinking the issue. We have a lot of homeless people. We need a lot of affordable housing. And we need that to be the goal. So that's something that I see. That being said, knowing change is long and slow. There are innovative solutions in Eugene that I see play out really well for people that look like small communities, small shelter communities with common space, kitchens, like have regular meetings that are self-policing, like that the rules are made by the people who live in that community. And we do not respond to those locations a lot. I'm at the shelters a few times a shift, but I can go months without responding to some of these small, we call them Conestoga communities. I'll send a link in the chat. And so I do think, yeah, while we are still deciding that solving homelessness is with housing is the right idea, solutions like this are more effective as I see them play out in the field.
Absolutely. And I think you also brought up a point that I wanted to touch on as well, is like the importance of agency and like respect for these individuals as individuals. You know, a lot of times it's everyone else feels like they may know the correct solution for people who are experiencing homelessness, but we need to respect them as individuals and the fact that they should have some type of autonomy over their bodies and over their own situation. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's a question that I wanted to touch on. And Bob, I know that John put his question in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to respond via chat or via unmuting yourself.
Sorry, I put myself on the self-mute there. Yeah, and of course, I'd agree fully. I think, and I did respond to John in the chat, that hot officers should be in alternate uniforms. I think it's an advantage that's perhaps is unrealized, as I've seen them at graduations and out on the streets. I can recognize who they are, but it may be tough for those who actually need their service. So it's an opportunity that I think is being missed. The non-response is actually, it's a mystery to me. I mean, as a chief, my direction was we respond to all, do all, take all, and treat people the same. You know, treat them with human dignity and respect, treat them with empathy, which I think is a great missing piece to much of the response and policing. And one of those bully pulpits I've been on for quite a while is this respect, professionalism, and empathy that will create a police department that's responsive to these needs as well as others. But I'll talk to the chiefs here locally to like, hey, here's what I hear. Here's some of the things I see. What are the experiences in your eyes? You know, would you like to, let me know? It helps my research and certainly helps my advocacy as I try to work with agencies nationally on moving them forward, because I don't know that there are perfect solutions. As Voltaire once said, that perfect is often the enemy of the good. So we look at how do we resolve issues? How do we meet the human needs? How do we retain dignity? I hadn't really thought as much about the homeless housing as others here have, but it's a great point. I mean, it's now one of my newer speaking points, and I do agree. We need not to do things in the short term because they feel good or they're quickly solving problems, because you inevitably, from a systems perspective, make the long-term problem worse. So we don't want to do a short-term problem that feels good and then that lump under the rug comes out in a year or two and we have to deal with it again. We want to work on long-term solutions that address certainly a human tragedy that I think we can resolve.
Right, right. And I think a good point is also brought up here too, is like the need for communication, the need for collaboration. I think a lot of people, we have possible solutions, or maybe sometimes the police have possible ideas of ways to, interact with certain communities, but events like these, where we can talk to each other and ask each other questions, I think is really important. And unfortunately, it is almost 7:40, which means that we're about to wrap up. And as soon as we get into the meat of everything, unfortunately, it always feels like it's over, but we'll definitely make sure to, if anybody has any questions, we'll definitely follow up. But I did see your hand, Curtis, if you had something to say or had a question before we kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch that. I just want to make clear that I appreciate the work that Bob does, and that I think what happens is a lot of times when we say, we would like to have the police in different and not in this space or that space, people take it as like an anti-cop altogether. It's like, here's this anti-cop stuff going on. It's not about that. It's about spaces where people, it's not just with homelessness. I look at it the same way with the mental health community and the PERT teams. I believe that the PERT teams should operate separately from the police. I think that when the PERT team pulls up in a police cruiser and jumps out of a police car to approach a crisis situation with a person, I don't think that's a good look. I think that they should operate separately. I don't think the police should really respond to mental health crisis situation, because as you see, most times what happens, they get killed. A lot of times, they end up dead or are physically injured. It's not about anti-cop. It's about staying in your lane. It's about being and respecting spaces where you're most effective and where you're not effective. And you can't claim all these different territories and say, call me for everything. You can't do that. And I think that people should not be in the same spaces with cops, as the PERT team has changed their entire character and persona as a direct result of riding around with the police, and they are starting to talk like them now. They are starting to act like them. I see the PERT team now getting out of police cars and actually walking up to mental health crisis people and talking to them actually like cops. Hey, you, what seems to be the problem here? Well, this is not going to really help you. So what do you think this is? It's like they're starting to take on this, and it's subconsciously, or they may not know it, but you're going to be influenced and you're going to take it on. If you hang with a certain group, you're going to become like them. It doesn't matter who it is. It's not saying that they're bad. It's just saying that you become like, if you get around a bunch of entrepreneurs, you're probably going to end up being like them too. So the thing is that, separate people from spaces where they belong. And that's basically what I'm saying there. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, of course. And I think that you bring a good point of, there are situations for certain teams to be dispatched. I don't know if that's the correct terminology for that, but there's certain situations where maybe the police should go here, just like the police versus the fire department versus the ambulance. Like, why can't there be others, people like cahoots or PERT teams or stuff like that? Like, being able to kind of educate ourselves on more ways, or more possible solutions. So as we are about to close up, I just wanted to give some space to Swift, Harrison, Curtis, if you want to hop back off mute, just to give space for any final thoughts or takeaways for the audience. I know a lot of us are all over the country, really. I mean, mostly on the West Coast, but just any key takeaways or things that we should be left with. And I will let Swift go first.
I'll go for it. Okay. Yeah, Cahoots is a wonderful model. We were born out of our own community specific needs 32 years ago, and it's not going to be copy paste moving forward, nor should it be. Models should be looking for like, who is their white bird clinic in their community, who has already been interacting with needs for decades. Where is their trust? And again, like speaking to the fact that we're a separate agency is a lot of what keeps us safe and a lot of what builds our rapport in the community. We handle about 18% of the calls that come through our dispatch in the city of Eugene. That doesn't mean all 18% of the calls that we do are calls that police would otherwise respond to, but that means 18% of over we handle like around 120,000 calls a year. At any given point, there are only 1 or 2 cahoots vans on the road with teams of 2 in them. So we are handling 18% with a very, very limited budget and a very, very limited amount of vans on the road, especially compared to law enforcement, especially compared to EMS and the fire department. Imagine what we could do if we were given the resources that we want, need, and the whole community is asking for, especially since 2020. So the scope, if allowed, with city budgets, law enforcement blessing, to be in that system as we build towards a bigger and better world, the implications are huge and people can remain safe. People still get killed by police in Eugene though. So it is not the solution to ending police violence. It is a very effective partnership.
Absolutely, for sure. Thank you for sharing, Swift. And once again, thank you so much for being on the call today. We really appreciate it. Curtis, Bob, whoever wants to kind of give their closing words first, by all means.
I'll go. I certainly say I love to hear the different voices and perspectives. Whether I may agree or disagree with a specific perspective, I appreciate that someone is honest enough to support me by providing it and giving me an opportunity to consider it and think about why, okay, if people are in this worldview, what can I do to ameliorate it? I would say that in general, and probably where I started from, that like politics, all policing is local. What works in Portland might not work in Chula Vista, might not work in Fremont and other places. There are a lot of good things going on. Coordinating those and scaling them. In change theory, what's important is short-term wins. Build credibility, work on top of success, create a foundation, then it expand from there. I know the vast majority of people in policing would love to have agencies to which they can refer some of the social problems. I do know that many of them are intertwined with criminal issues, especially those in family violence, where the police are a necessary tool to work hand in glove with social services and intervention services is of advantage, but it inevitably has to be a local solution. City and County of Los Angeles, I think, is a really, really strong mental evaluation unit, referral process, hospitalization for mental health crises, and diversion and navigation to services. But it works for LA, and they in New York and a few others are of that size. Smaller communities will have different resources. The real truth, though, is take what you have, look at what you need, establish a vision for what you want it to be, and then work to that vision.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bob. We appreciate your time once again, and we will leave it off with Curtis.
Okay. Hey, thank you. Yeah, I would say that I would place emphasis on collaborating and working to understand one another. Everybody's working on this same goal. Everybody has the same goal in mind, but they need to get together on it. Everybody's working at a different angle, and nobody actually has the answer to resolve the issues. We're working on it, and so in order for us to get a complete understanding is we have to understand each other. And the issues at hand should not be looked on as a job. It should be something that we naturally care about. If it's a job, it's not going to happen. If you have a job working for a housing provider, then you're no good to me because you have a job. You're doing your job. I don't want to deal with anybody who's doing their job. I want to deal with somebody who actually, there's people who get in different careers for different reasons. Now it seems to be people are getting in careers for reasons that are not related to actually being a service and to being more, this makes more money. I'm going to get into this because they make more money. And if that's the case, then we can't resolve and work together at all. But in working together, we have to understand the people who have been impacted the most, because that's where the answers lie. And a lot of us don't have the ability to express ourselves correctly. I was part of the prison industrial complex. I was in prison for years and didn't understand the system a bit. You know who explained the system to me? Someone who hadn't been, because they knew how the system worked. I was just in the system and I didn't understand the system. You know, so a lot of us, we have to work together to understand this. A lived experience person is like a gas can, and a person without the lived experience is like a car. I'm in a can full of gas and you're a car on empty. We can't do anything without each other. So we do need each other, but if you don't feel like you need me, then you will never understand. The big shots sitting in the offices who's running these housing commissions and all that, they'll never really do any good without hearing from us. You know, you got to hear from us. And I think that that would be my final words, is to become involved with lived experience people, try to understand where people are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you all coming and sharing. And there was a quote that came to mind as you all were talking, is that, you know, people don't necessarily care how much you know until they know how much you care. So to your point, Curtis, they want to make sure people are really here for the cause and making sure that we're all for the same goal. And in order to really get things done, we need to be able to talk to one another and understand what other people are coming from, to all work towards the goal together. So with that, I know we went 5 minutes over. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. I think this was a really great event. I know I learned a lot, and I always wish there was more time, because we all really get into the conversation. And like I said, I wish there was more time, but thank you all so much for spending your evenings with us. And I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Great. Thank you, Sienna. Appreciate the
Of
time.
course. Thank you so much, Bob.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Bye. Good night.